Hello and welcome to the very first episode of A State of Politics. I'm your host, Declan McConville, and I'm joined by my co-host, Patrick McGill. Patrick, how you doing, mate?
Great, how are you?
I'm well, mate, I'm well. And today our very first guest is FRASER Stewart of the University of Strathclyde. We both know Fraser very well from uni. Fraser, how you doing?
Just about existing, mate. How are you guys getting on?
We're all right. All our
I'm
essays
not
I've
bad.
done for you, so we're a wee bit happier. We're a wee bit happy about that. So, just in general, Fraser, if you want to give us a wee bit of a background of the work you do at Strathclyde University and anything else you usually get up to.
So I'm a researcher and an activist. I research mostly looking at how to use renewable energy for social justice and economic justice. So how we can use renewable energy and clean technology in general to combat things like poverty and inequality. That's the research work that I do. That's a lot of the work I do in the field. But as you guys know probably too well, I also teach at Strathclyde. So I teach Scottish politics, I teach British politics, and a whole load of other things in between as well. So that's me.
Brilliant. I think I'm right in saying you grew up in Forfar or Dundee area? Up that
That's
way?
right, aye. Forfar, just north of Dundee.
How did you go from there to doing a lot of climate research at the University of Strathclyde?
Fuck knows, man. Fuck knows. So I grew up. I grew up in a couple of different. You know what? I was back fairly recently, whenever COVID allowed us. Sort of wandering about the places that I grew up, catching up with old pals and all that kind of stuff. And I just had no concept when I was growing up. Like I knew I grew up in rough areas, but I had no concept when I was growing up just how fucking rough they were, until I came back after being in Glasgow for a few years now. But the way that it happened was I grew up in various different schemes, did shite at school. I just wanted to smoke weed and get pissed with my pals, which is what I did. Got kicked out of school, ended up on the brew for ages, in and out a couple of jobs, and then wanted to go back to college, do my hires, did my hires, and that was the first time I'd been introduced to modern studies. So I feel like you guys probably it was offered at your high school, right? More likely than not.
Yep.
It was never offered in Forfar. They didn't teach it in Forfar at all. I don't know why that was. But I went back to Dundee College when I was in my early 20s to do my hires, did modern studies there, and that's where we started talking about more about sort of social justice, inequality, poverty, and that kind of stuff from a political standpoint, from a policy perspective. So I'd lived it, I'd experienced it, been on the brew, I'd even worked in a job centre for a wee while. But I hadn't been exposed to the kind of politics policy side of it until going back to college. So that ended up getting into Strathclyde, did the undergrad politics international relations, and picked up a sort of keen interest in climate and stuff like that from there. So that's the story, that's the history of how we got to it. But then obviously the stuff that I'm doing now, linking those things together, it's quite a natural progression. But also you don't hear a lot of accents like mine, or see a lot of folk from places like I'm from in these spaces. So that always made me a bit more tenacious and made me want to work on that kind of stuff and bring that perspective a bit more. So that's a very long way of saying this is how we got here.
Do you think that bit of experience you've had in life, Fraser's maybe put you in good stead for your work now? Because I know definitely as students you're a bit more a relatable character than just somebody that's maybe came through the system from day one and is in there, whereas you seem to, I don't know, your method of teaching just seems to be a lot more something that you can relate to, whereas a lot of academics, it's very hard and you use a lot of language, it's just difficult. Do you think that wee bit of life experience, if you'll call it that, stood you in good stead to go forward?
I think it definitely has. First of all, I appreciate you saying that, but it definitely has. And I think it works especially well at Strathclyde, which is in the centre, but to the east of Glasgow, historically a lot better access for working class students. It has a lot of international students as well, but a lot of them also tend to be from, like, bearing in mind, you don't have to be Scottish to be working class. So I think that combination of there being a lot of working class students and myself being from that kind of background, I think it undoubtedly helps. I think there are quite a few academics at Strathclyde in politics who are also working class, but I think the further you get into the field, the further away from those roots you can get. Like being in such a middle class field, especially something like climate or energy politics, anything like that, it kind of fucking kicks the accent out of you, it kicks the roots out of you a lot, and you're forced onto this very highfalutin, this very highbrow, onto these different terms. So you're having these much more sort of complicated conversations. So I think not just having that background, I feel like properly just kissing my own ass here, but not just having that background, but I keep a foot in it as well. Like I go home regularly and see my pals back there. I'm still in amongst it as well. So I think, again, long way to say it, but I think that definitely is a big part of it. But it works especially well in a uni like Strathclyde.
Do you think having working class voices doing what you do is important? Because when you hear some climate activists, maybe David Attenborough or something, talk about going vegan or using less single-use plastics and all that, whereas sometimes that isn't financially an option for working class people.
Yeah, I think it's essential. I think there's a big part of this, right? So I'd say there are two parts to this, Patrick. Right, the first is that when we're talking about having these choices, which is what the sort of mainstream media discussion tends to be focused on, right? It focuses a lot on. I was on the radio the other week talking about this stuff, and they asked me. They were talking about, okay, so choice is available to middle class people. They can afford to buy electric vehicles. They can afford to go vegan. They have the know-how to retrofit their homes. They own their homes so they can insulate it, etc., etc., etc. And the question that I got asked was, how do we make it so that working class people can make the choices? And I says, no, it's not about making working class people make choices, because we're putting personal responsibility onto what is a much bigger systemic issue, but also, again, choice is fundamentally a middle class thing to be talking about, right? So the reason that we need more working class people in these spaces is that climate change affects everyone. It doesn't just affect the middle classes. The solutions that we design affects everyone, doesn't just affect the middle classes. So if you want to have a transition away from fossil fuels, away from single-use plastics, a transition to a net zero society with no emissions overall, the sort of the dream that we're pushing for, if you want to do that in a way that's fair, in a way that's prosperous for everyone, in a way that brings everyone along for the journey, you need to have more than just middle class voices at the table. You need to have working class people not just being listened to, but actively leading discussions and having those conversations as well. So it's about moving away from the middle class idea of personal choice, but also making sure that the change can be reflective of the needs of society as a whole, rather than just one group who gets to make the decisions.
I know there's been a lot documented, Fraser, in recent times. There's been a BBC programme on about it as well, in terms of class in Scotland. Do you think it's still a big issue in Scotland, class, that people feel as if they can't do anything because of what class and social background that they come from?
I think class is still a big thing, but I don't think it's any less prominent in society, but I think we understand it a lot less than we used to. So I'm assuming just talking about Darren's program, Darren McGarvey's. Yeah. Darren's a great guy, and he's doing amazing stuff to try and unpack those relationships. But a lot of the common themes throughout it is that class is very, very subjective, depending on who you're asking, whether they identify as working class, whether they think certain professions are working class. So it's really, really complicated. I think a lot of people definitely feel like it still defines them. And a lot of people, myself included, right, working in a middle class field, but I like cling desperately to this idea, like, no, I'm working class. Materially, I'm probably not. But at heart, in my mindset, psychologically, socially, I still very much consider myself to be. So I'd say working class at heart rather than materially working class. And I think a lot of people would say the same for themselves. What I would also say is that it tends to be working class people who talk more about class. Middle class people don't like to talk about class because they very rarely feel the sort of sharp end of it. They very rarely feel opportunities curtailed based on their accent or based on where they've grown up or what their mum and dad did, or whether they've had battles with addiction or been to jail or whatever it might be, right? So I think it's something that half of society probably is still feeling affects them acutely and intimately, but that a whole load of other people don't really understand fully. So it's a big massive, it's a big blob of an issue that's definitely still prominent, but not necessarily as clearly as it might have been before.
Going back to climate change, obviously not using using electric cars, not using single-use plastics, reducing meat and sort of fish intake, that's all important and helps. Do you think governments could do more for working class people who can't necessarily afford to adopt that sort of lifestyle?
Yeah, they need to. They absolutely need to. So what we're doing, right, is if you take an example, I'll not get too deep into like specific niche policies, but if you take the example of what the UK government rolled out and then very quickly rolled back in the last 6 months, it was a policy called the Green Homes Grant, which was effectively a subsidy of £5,000 or £10,000 for people to put insulation in their lofts, for people to install double glazing, all that kind of stuff. There was a lot of money sunk into that scheme, which necessarily is inaccessible to a lot of working class people, especially if you live in a private rented house, especially if you don't know how to access policies like that, or you don't know the kind of stuff that you need to do to install insulation or install double glazing, or you don't know who to contact about that kind of stuff. So we've had a lot of conversations and funneled a lot of money into subsidising middle class people. I say middle class people, I don't mean it in like a big evil way, but a lot of money into subsidising middle class people to undertake these things, to install solar panels, to increasingly today to buy electric vehicles and things like that. When in reality, a lot of middle class people, and now not all of them are entirely wealthy, but in reality, a lot of middle class people can afford to do those things. Now, the subsidies help, and where people can afford to make those choices, they should. But we're at a formative moment in human history where we're talking about reimagining how we do things on a massive scale. Everything that we do, right? We're reimagining how we do transport. We're reimagining housing, land, jobs, industry, anything that you can imagine. In between that is getting rethought and reworked. Why not reimagine that in a way that addresses poverty and inequality? So instead of subsidising electric vehicle infrastructure, which will play a part, why not expand clean public transport, which can also connect excluded working class communities? Instead of exclusively subsidising people to install insulation in their homes or solar panels, why not target retrofit schemes at low-income households and bring some of their energy bills down at the same time? So I think there's a lot more that we can be doing collectively. And I don't mean that just in the personal responsibility side of things. I mean, there's a lot more that we can be doing to have a lot more good beyond simply reducing emissions. Climate change is an opportunity to work against social and economic injustice. And that's only going to happen if we move the discussion away from facilitating personal choice into more widespread collective policy action.
At the point we're at just now, we're still obviously living through this pandemic, but I've got a Scottish election coming up. You know, people are going to be looking at policies in terms of looking forward, because we're at a juncture just now where we can look at how Scotland can improve and be a better country coming back from COVID, what we could learn of this pandemic. Everybody's changed their lives. So one of the guests that we're going to be talking to is Cool Cab Stewart, and I think one of her policies was to try and reduce emissions in the city centre of Glasgow, because it's part of her constituency. They've saw a drop in emissions with the less traffic and whatnot going through in there. How important do you think the Scottish election is going to be to addressing the concerns that we've got with climate and with everything that we've got just now going forward? Because across the world we can see a world that was broken, and my biggest fear is we're going to just return to that broken world and it's just going to get worse.
I share that sentiment a bit, Declan. I do. I hope that climate and these bigger issues, especially with COP coming to Glasgow later this year, I would hope that these issues are going to be bigger than they have been so far. So bearing in mind, right, at this point, at the point of recording, we still haven't had party manifestos. So we might see a lot more emphasis on these things over the next month or so. I sincerely hope we do. But from the first debate, there was a big focus on Lorna Slater from the Greens, and she had a brilliant performance. But she was the only one really talking any kind of game on climate. And that's the way that it's always been. This is part of the problem. I think it's part of the reason that a lot of working class people feel like climate isn't their fight, is because we leave the discussion to the Greens and the middle class lovies, when in reality it's a much bigger discussion. So far, it's kind of gone the usual way. I hope that changes going forward. The SNP, people will question their green credentials, question the action that they've taken so far, especially on things like creating jobs to replace the North Sea oil and gas jobs and stuff like that. But certainly the SNP administration in Glasgow, I don't want to sing their praises too much because I've got a lot of problems with them, But in Glasgow, they've done a lot of great work. They're having the right conversations. They've set the very ambitious targets that kind of exceed most of the UK-wide targets. So they're doing quite well there. But in Scotland, we've got a very bad habit of hiding behind our turbines. So we go, oh no, look at us, look at all our renewable energy. But again, this feeds back to, well, actually, you've got a lot of justice issues tied up here, a lot of class issues tied up here that we need to get a lot more serious on as well. So yeah, going into an election immediately before Glasgow hosts COP, I hope we see a lot more ambition on this kind of stuff.
While we're just on elections, the Green Party in Scotland and in England and Wales keep growing and growing. I noticed recently that the Green Party in Germany are actually second in the polls. Do you think there could be a sort of worldwide green movement where the Green Party are in government all over the world to sort of, because other parties aren't ambitious enough?
Man, in an ideal world, maybe. I don't know. Greens still have the reputation in too many places, I think, as being a bit fringe and as being a bit middle class and as being a bit overly concerned with the environment. But if you dig down into the conversations that Greens are having now, it's much more socialist. It's much more justice focused. Not everywhere. Green parties vary in their messaging from country to country. But a lot of Green parties are talking about social issues. They are taking big stances on economic issues as well, right? So I think Greens will continue to grow. And I like that we're talking about that as well. The last few elections, especially across Europe, people have been talking about, what are the far right going to do? The far right are surging. But actually, in every single election, the Greens are growing. They're chipping away. They're adding 0.5%, 1% here and there. So they're coming through, and they're coming into a few more coalitions here and there. In Germany, there's a feasible chance of them holding some kind of balance of power at this stage. That's exciting. That's a major global democracy, potentially with some kind of green influence. So I think it's exciting. I think we will see more Greens feature in coalitions. I think that'll necessarily mean more action on climate. How sustainable that is and how soon it happens, I think is a different question, and we just have to wait and see.
Just on that, I remember when the I think it's Alternative for Deutschland, they get 12% in 2017, and I think Newsnight done about 7 features on them, whereas the Green Party in Germany are now in something like 20%, and Newsnight suddenly aren't interested. It's like it's as if there's a fascination with the far right, despite the fact that the world is burning.
Yeah, I honestly I can't put my finger. It's something that I've thought about. I can't put my finger on exactly why it is. I don't know if it's because there is genuine sort of strong far right support and interest here if there's genuine far right support and interest here that the BBC are trying to tap into. I don't know if it's the kind of shock value reporting that's more likely to garner sort of clicks and views as opposed to look how good the Greens are doing. I don't know why it is, but it's a huge disservice to the wider climate conversation. It's also a huge disservice when we talk about the class elements of it, when we talk about the justice elements of climate and all the more ambitious things we could be doing. That becomes more feasible when you're having bigger conversations in media. So if you're sort of fucking the Greens away into a corner so that you can talk about the far right, rather than going, oh my God, there's popular support here, where can this go? Then you're naturally dampening the things that can be achieved on the Green front. So I think I don't know why it happens, but I think it's fundamentally a really bad thing.
What do you think Scottish voters coming up to this election, obviously we don't have manifestos as of yet, should be looking out for? Because we can talk about climate, we can talk about how we reduce emissions, how we can go a lot more greener, certainly in the next 5 years. But what do you think is the key things that Scottish voters should be looking out for as we get manifestos and during these debates? What do you think are the key policy areas that people need to be looking at for Scotland to move forward here?
Not just in terms of climate or with the climate focus?
Both, a bit of both.
A bit of both. So I think one of the big ones that we need to be looking out for is there's a large consensus about the need for more green jobs. I think pinning parties down on specifically where, how many, how skilled, who needs to retrain, all this kind of stuff. I think this needs to focus at the very, very front of it. That speaks to a wider need to focus on what we call the just transition. So when we say reducing emissions in a way that is beneficial to workers to communities, all that kind of stuff. That's what we call the just transition. The Scottish Government commissioned a report into the just transition. What can Scotland do to make sure that the transition to net zero is not just about reducing emissions, but also doesn't create inequalities, doesn't leave people out of work, doesn't leave people out of pocket. There are a lot of really interesting recommendations in that report, and I recommend anyone who has half an interest in this stuff to take a swatch at it. But look out for things like that. So don't just look at how are we going to reduce emissions. Look at, well, are they talking about jobs? Are they talking about communities? Are they talking about redistribution? Are they talking about organising? Are they talking maybe not necessarily about class, but how to involve people who, like Patrick talked about earlier, don't really have the luxury of being able to make a lot of the choices that we're talking about? Are we talking about linking climate, energy, and all that good stuff to people who maybe aren't thinking about that at the front of their minds, to people who are having to make the choice between heating their houses and feeding their kids? Make sure that they're not just talking about sort of leafy, rough, broad commitments about 100,000 green jobs or expanding public transport. Look at the specifics of that and try and pin down something, because only with sort of specific idea of what's going to get done, I think, do we have something to hold people on. Aside from that, in terms of the big issues that I think are going to come up in the election in general, you're obviously going to have COVID, you're going to have recovery. So I think that's another area where climate, renewables, jobs are going to feature, is in COVID recovery. So I'll be interested to see that. I imagine a lot of other people will be interested to see that as well. The SNP's record on education is bound to come up. Healthcare, naturally, is bound to come up. And as always, the big independence question is going to be there. Probably, as always, it's going to dominate a lot of the discussion as well. But it's a sign of the times, right? It's a sign of the times.
Just before we move on to the election, you're talking about what the Scottish Government, what the UK Government can do. There's a stat going about that it's 71% of all global emissions are down to 100 companies alone. Can even the British Government do enough, or do enough to offset these 100 companies? Because in the States, you've got Ocasio-Cortez with the Green New Deal. Biden's doing a sort of watered down version of that. But in like Asia, I don't think they're as dedicated to climate as much as they are over here. So what can little Scotland do, basically, to protect the climate when it's a worldwide issue?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think that's an important question. I think the answer to the first part of it is no. The UK government, the Scottish government cannot offset 71% of all emissions from fossil fuel companies, especially not when the UK government is still subsidising fossil fuel companies, when it's still giving money to North Sea oil and gas, not just to transition, but for new exploration. They're not giving them money for new exploration for them to not start drilling again, right? This is the whole point. So, number one, no, they're absolutely not going to offset all of those emissions, especially not by subsidising them. You can offset a whole lot of emissions by doing better on transport, which is a good starting point. You can offset a whole load of emissions by doing better on housing, which is why we talk so much about retrofit and about decarbonising the heat sector and all this kind of stuff. But this, again, speaks to the big issue of needing to get more non-middle class, more non-traditional, more sort of radical voices into the climate discussion, because you are fundamentally unlikely to completely change a system that is built on fossil fuels. You're unlikely to challenge power and wealth within that current system if you're only involving people who largely benefit from that system. That is, people with money, people with the luxury of choice. You're unlikely to change that system by only talking to people who broadly benefit from the system. So this is why it's so important to get a broad coalition across classes, across race, across all different social groups, across gender, across anything and everything, across civic society. This is why it's important to try and bring everyone that we can along with us, because you need this broad coalition to stimulate big systemic change. This is why it's exciting in Scotland, because Scotland's come so far on renewables, because we've done quite a lot on climate already. Again, it's not going to be enough on its own, but because we've come so far, people are banging at the door and they're going, okay, well, what next? What next? What's the big picture? What can we do to show even more leadership on this? So I think taking that leadership and trying to build a big coalition, getting working class people on the playing field, getting people on the playing field who fundamentally don't like the system as it is and want to change it, not just to reduce emissions, but to change it generally for social, for economic justice as well. That's why it's so critical to get those people on the playing field, because we're not just trying to bring Scotland's emissions down, we're trying to change a fucking system.
Fraser, you mentioned the word coalition there. It takes us on nicely to what we're probably going to talk about next. You also said that the constitutional question is a sign of the times in Scottish politics. We've got the emergence of a new political party in Scotland who are talking about supermajorities. How healthy or how damaging do you think that is to our political system that we have the emergence of the new Alba Party?
I don't think that the emergence of a new party is damaging to a political system in general. I think two things are damaging. I think the first thing is trying to game electoral systems. I think some electoral systems are just bad. First past the post is absolutely terrible, and that has been gamed to the point of no return. There's no redemption for the UK for Westminster elections while there's first past the post. In Scotland, we've got a bit of a better crack at it. Even though it's an imperfect electoral system, it's still more representative, and we still have a better opportunity, at least on the list vote, to have some fair representation within Holyrood. So parties that are formed purely designed to game that system, to manufacture this kind of synthetic supermajority, I think that's bad. I don't think it's necessarily, if you want a good electoral system, if you want a healthy democracy, it has to be representative. Gaming a system by necessity is not a representative process. So I think that's point number one. I think that's an issue. I think the second issue is that we've prolonged the circus of salmon and sturgeon with the Alba Party. That's largely by design. I think the way that Alex Salmond's capitalised on the whole inquiry into him, into the handling of the investigation into the allegations against him, I think that was cynical. I think that was dirty. I don't think it does Scottish politics any good to try and to sort of keep those really sort of brash psychodrama discussions going. I don't think it sends a great message to women in this country that people like, not even just Salmond, but Galloway as well, with his fucking whatever it is he's bringing to the table now with him and his mad hat. I don't think that sends a great message to women in this country who have by and large just had to watch concerns that are broadly brought forward by a substantial number of women completely criminally fucking mishandled in media and in the parliamentary chamber as well. So I don't think that having, I've laboured that point.
Just on that, the opinion of women, what message does it send when women come forward against a man in power? The complaints are mishandled by a government. He's then found innocent by a court. And then for an entire year, it's turned into a sort of circus, as you put it, about political personalities. And then we've now got the potential for someone who's acted inappropriately to several women while in a position of power, getting back into Parliament by thousands of people voting for him. What message does that send to not only women now, but in future times?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely bang on. It sends a fucking terrible message, an absolutely terrible message, in that their concerns and issues. This is important, right? Alex Salmond was found not guilty. That's fair. He admitted to being a fucking creep. That's important as well. It's still saying that, okay, I wasn't criminal, so I'm still of a high enough standard to hold public office in Scotland. Yet I also happen to think that the woman who may or may not have heard about the allegations 3 days before she claims to have heard about the allegations should have to resign her position because it's a breach of ministerial code, and that's absolutely not on. The double standard is mind-boggling. The mental gymnastics is unfucking believable. And I think it sends a terrible message to women that your issues will be used for point scoring. Your issues will be used not as a serious issue in themselves, but as a wedge around which a new political party can seize an opportunity. I think one point that I think is worth picking up on from the previous question as well is that there is a constituency there for Alba. There are people who support them. There are thousands of people across the country. How many and whether that's going to translate into actual seats, we don't know yet. We won't know until the election. But there is a constituency there. So from the cold, hard sort of democratic perspective, that should be allowed to be reflected. But in terms of the people leading that discussion, the way that they use that inquiry as a springboard, they use the concerns and inappropriate behaviour as a springboard into this election, I think sends a dreadful message to female voters across the country.
On that, Fraser, if we do see Alba make any gains in the Scottish parliamentary elections, we don't know. But we've seen people defect from the SNP and go over. Do you think the people that did that, it's fair for them still to hold their position, even though they've campaigned with a party to get that seat? I'm thinking of a specific MP in Kenny McCaskill here who then goes over to Alba. There's a lot of hard people out there that are out there campaigning. They're out champing doors, will have done so to get Kenny McCaskill elected to Westminster at the time. Now he leaves that position. It also goes for the same as Douglas Ross, who's kept on his position at Westminster. Do you think politicians could do a lot more to send better messages that if they are going to change their mind, it is natural in life that you may change your mind, you may look for a different direction, but you do the right thing and step away from that position and let voters decide again?
Yeah, so no, I don't think it's fair that they keep their position. Yes, I do think the decent thing to do would be to step aside and say we need to hold better standards. The goalposts have completely changed. A lot of them. There's not a huge amount that have defected so far, but the MPs that have defected have made songs and dances about other people doing the same in the past. They've also made a big song and dance about Brexit happening. They've also made a big song and dance about things like Brexit happening, about material changes that now justify a new independence referendum. I think changing party is also a material change, and I think it does a huge disservice to your own voters to then say, thanks for electing me on one platform, I now stand for something completely different, but I'm going to keep the platform anyway.
Just on that, I think Salmond said either yesterday or today that if there is a supermajority, whatever a supermajority is, I don't know. I thought there already was one with the Greens, but there you go. If there is a supermajority, independence negotiations should start the following week. What is your thoughts on that policy?
I don't think it makes any sense. I understand the drive for it, but you can't just say, like, he's just invented that. He's just said a supermajority is grounds to start discussions about independence. Since when? Since when? We're trying to... A big part of governance, full stop, of democracy, full stop, is the idea of consensus, of shared ideals, shared goals, shared ways of doing things, right? There has to be some level of mutual understanding, especially for big changes like independence to ever happen. The mutual understanding on independence is that it will happen through a popular referendum. Now, obviously, there's a whole big... Now, obviously, there's a whole big thing about, will Boris allow another referendum? Will he not? That's a slightly different conversation, although I appreciate that it's wrapped up in it. But the Scottish public, in general, expects that independence will happen on the back of a successful yes vote in an independence referendum. I think if you go off and you start trying to have those discussions on your own, I don't think it leads anywhere. I don't understand what it is that we think we would hope to achieve. And maybe this is on me not doing enough digging into it, but I don't understand what we hope to achieve by starting those discussions rather than starting discussions using a supermajority, if you think that's suddenly an important concept in Scottish politics, then using that as a springboard for a Section 30 and having a referendum which the public are expecting independence to happen around, rather than going rogue and starting discussions of your own accord. I don't think it stacks up at all.
I think something, Fraser, that people have been critical of is in the past 5 years since the SNP get re-elected to government, that people make an argument that have not made strides. But I think what their plan has been is to listen to voters and try and get those polls climbing, that they can come to a point where it looks as if it could happen, then they can go for it. Whereas this idea that Alba is going to just kind of go for it again would just seem to be a kind of repeat of the past, and the failings of 2014 would again just come to fruition. But moving on from that, to the more mainstream parties, on the constitutional question, again, we saw a TV leaders debate last week that featured the main parties. It featured Nicola Sturgeon, Anna Sarwar, Douglas Ross, Lorna Slater, and Willie Rennie. The Tories are striking a very strange note in this election where they say that the constitutional question isn't important, but seem to keep questioning it. Now, they seem to have grown arms and legs. They keep mentioning it in recent years to become the party of opposition in Scotland. Do you think that place is cemented, or could we see a bit of a changing of the guard in Scotland again, going back to Labour with possible more Green MSPs getting elected to Holyrood this time around?
I do think, taking that in reverse order, Declan, I do think we'll see a few more Greens. I think based on recent polling, based on the concentration of their vote shares from what we broadly understand about it, it's promising for them. I also, I'm not a big fan of making predictions. I realise I just made one, but I'm not a big fan, and you guys know this from conversations we have in class. I'm not big on making predictions, but it does feel like Labour are making inroads and the Tories are quite routinely, Douglas Ross specifically, is quite routinely embarrassing himself. I don't think he's coming off particularly well. I don't think he's really connecting with people the way that he thought he would. And I do think that people generally can see that the party who is gaining the most from keeping the topic of independence alive, the party who's talking about it by far more than any other party, is the Scottish Conservatives. I think people kind of see through that, back to the day job, you're obsessed with independence. I think people broadly understand that it's the Conservatives who are keeping that discussion within the mainstream debate alive, because they know that that's where their support comes from. They want to be, they're not a party that necessarily stands for anything at this stage. I dare say when the manifesto comes out, we'll get a flavour of some of the ideas that they have. But their popular mantra is absolutely no to IndyRef, to oppose the SNP. They want to be the most anti-SNP, anti-IndyRef party that there is, because they know that Labour have an issue of trying to straddle both sides of the argument, because they know that a lot of their own supporters are probably pro-independence as well. But the Labour idea of let's talk more about recovery, the Labour idea of let's sort of cut through the Indy obsession with a little bit more of a policy focus seems to be working quite well this time around. Not going to get them anywhere fucking near government, but I think it could very well be enough to reclaim second place after Tories.
You said that you don't want to make any predictions, but I'm going to ask you. You touched on it there with the Labour Party. Just about everyone or every group, when polling is done, under the age of 65 supports independence, and it only gets higher as you get younger. Over time, can you see it reaching 60, 65, 70%? And in a scenario where Boris Johnson and the Tories keep saying no, the Labour Party adopts a sort of we'll grant you a referendum policy, because otherwise they're going to end up in a scenario where 70% of the country supports something and they've only really got two parties to promote that.
So I think it's a very, very interesting question. I think there's definitely scope for Labour, as in UK Labour, to whenever they're going to fucking win power again.
Get them together.
I know. I think we might eventually just have to come to grips with the reality that the UK is fundamentally a conservative country. That's a different conversation. But I think within the polling, when you look at support, as we know, it's kind of generationally split. But across generations, a majority of people believe that independence is inevitable. They think it's coming. They expect, a lot of them support the idea of another referendum in the next 10 years. A lot of them think that it's only a matter of time. So even the people who are currently opposed to it, if we factor in hold a referendum in 10 years' time, maybe the generational balance will have shifted. Even the people who are opposed to it at this point in time think it's going to happen eventually. And that's quite a strong tide to contend against for any UK government party, I think.
I think Jerry Hassan's written a lot and spoke a lot how Scottish Labour have failed in recent years, Fraser. If they do come back as party opposition, do you think that's gaining a wee bit of ground back? Or do you think they're only doing that off the benefit of a Tory party that seems so obsessed with independence? They're not really giving voters any policies which is allowing Labour to kind of recapture a bit of the unionist vote who they they've probably lost in recent elections, especially at Westminster and the Scottish election last time out.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree with that. I think they're gaining ground back that they've lost since they've been in opposition. They're not gaining ground back that they lost historically that allowed the SNP to become the party of the establishment and the party of government in Scotland just now. So it's definitely they're clawing something back, but because the Tories have taken such a hard line on indie ref, they're clawing back the people who maybe aren't independent supporters, who maybe do consider themselves unionists, but like we say, maybe those people who think that actually it's probably coming at some point, or a referendum's coming down the line, or maybe they just don't define themselves as unionists and see something else in the Labour Party. So they're clawing back something, but I'm inclined to agree with Jerry Hassan in that they're pulling back out the unionist vote rather than the vote that made them the party of government in Scotland all those years ago.
Another issue that was very much headline news earlier in the year, I don't know if it's going to come up in the election campaign, was transphobia and trans rights. And this is something that I think all parties apart from the Tories committed to in 2016, and then it's sort of been shelved or kicked down the road. I think there's been consultations as well. Can you see, with a lot of people of a certain attitude towards the Gender Recognition Act, I should say, and attitude to the trans community leaving for, say, the Alba Party or something like that, can you see the SNP with the Greens and the Labour Party pushing ahead with this reform? And what do you think the sort of where will this go as an issue, basically, is what I'm trying to say?
I think they will push ahead with the reform. I don't. It's no secret what side of this I'm on. I sincerely hope they push ahead. I think it's an important piece of legislation, and I think it can do a lot of good for a group of people who are historically very marginalised, very at risk, and very ostracised in a lot of ways, socially, legally, and everything else. I don't think it's going to be a nice, quiet passing of a bill like most bills are. I think the opposition, and not just in Scotland but across the UK, the opposition to trans rights sort of writ large is so vocal and vicious that even like American campaigners and activists look at the UK and go, Jesus Christ, this is just such, it's so heated and so volatile in the UK. And I don't know the reason for it. I'm not intimately enough involved with the debate to be able to explain why it's so vicious in the UK. But I do think this might, not with an Alba supermajority, but I do think that it's an opportunity, and it seems to be as well. I don't want to be. I'm not a Labour voter or a supporter, but Labour seem to be holding out the olive branch on a lot of these issues, and I think trying to put their stamp down again as actually we do care about social justice. We're not all about independence or opposing independence, and I think that's actually going to be a really good thing for a lot of these debates that have been very, very intemperate, but they can also do a lot of good on the other side of it. So I would say I'm pretty hopeful, but it's probably going to get quite messy before it gets good, I would say.
Yeah, I think we would definitely agree with what you're saying there, Fraser, in terms of Labour holding out the olive branch. And it was good last week to see Labour Party, the Lib Dems, the Greens and the SNP all commit that they would work with each other on issues to help people and really tackle social justice, you know. I think many people that live in Scotland would like to see a fairer society that everything's accessible for everyone. Everybody feels as if they've got rights, and I think all three of us here would agree that that's what we'd like to see going forward. But on the SNP, on the party of governance, do you think their election, their stance this time is going to be beneficial? That they seem to be going for this tried and tested model that they're going for, with a big, ambitious policy plan, but this reiteration that its experienced leadership in Nicola Sturgeon is going to help the party in the long run, because it seems to be a different tack that they've taken from previous elections when the party have changed. They seem to, as we know, became the party of establishment in Scotland. But do you think this new idea of different tack in the election is going to serve them well as safe hands going forward?
I think it will. I think it will. I think it's something that we see discussed a lot, is that people, generally speaking, even if they don't like the SNP, they see Nicola Sturgeon as a competent leader. And I think they're well within their rights to play up to that. I think it's effective. A big part of the SNP's, and you touched on this earlier, Declan, a big part of the SNP's whole plan over the last 5, 6, 7 years was to prove that they're competent, to prove that they're a good party of management, to prove that they can be trusted, and to make an independent Scotland seem like a stable proposition against the backdrop of Brexit and chaos and all that kind of stuff. And I think they've done quite a good job of that. I think they've won a lot of voters round with that, previously either soft nose or don't knows, who are now, when we see independence polling as a majority proposition, when we see majority support for independence in the polls, that's come not from people who go, you know what, I am now a staunch nationalist. I'm going to get fucking Alba Party tattooed on my chest. I've got the William Wallace statue in the front room. It's come from people who have gone, well, actually, the UK is kind of on fire just now. Meanwhile, Nicola Sturgeon, the SNP broadly, have done everything that they physically can to demonstrate that they are a competent governing party. Now, that's not to say that they've been perfect. That's not to say that they've achieved everything they said they would set out to achieve. It's not to say that they haven't failed in a lot of ways on a lot of policies. But where they have been successful supremely, even through the whole the Holyrood inquiry stuff, is demonstrating that they're a very, very competent party. And I think, yeah, people are going to have that in mind, especially with the pandemic going on, coming into the election. I also think, and I don't want to be pure cynical about it, but I also think opening beer gardens a couple of weeks before an election is a fucking stroke of genius. I think that can't go wrong. That it can't possibly backfire on you. But yeah, I think they'll play up to confidence. They'll play up to stability, and I imagine it seems to be paying off so far.
When it comes to elections and possibly a future referendum, the SNP are a very broad church, more so than the Labour Party. You've got people like Mary Black and Fergus Ewing in the same party. You've got people like Joanna Chevy and Kirsty Blackman in the same party. Do you think, or would you like to see pro-independence parties be more centre-left or left-wing, bearing in mind that 75% of people voted for parties that weren't the Tories in the last general election?
I think, well, certainly, it needs a broad coalition, right? You're changing the whole constitutional makeup of a country. Excuse me. And now, accepting the point on 70% of people didn't vote for the Tories, that doesn't mean that 70% of people hold the same view as me on independence, right? So it has to be a broad church. And as much as I like the centre-left, the left-wing vision, as much as for me independence is an opportunity at more localised democracy, it's an opportunity at more localised decision-making, something a bit more inclusive, something a bit fairer. For a lot of people, that's not their reasoning for it. A lot of the new independent supporters that we're seeing, like we were just saying, are seeing it as a sort of a chance to move away from a UK system that looks inherently broken. So people have different reasons for supporting independence as it is. As much as I like the centre-left vision, I sort of believe a lot in that kind of the idea of a more egalitarian Scotland. You're not going to win enough of the popular vote to make people do that with just that vision, because then it becomes, I think, an issue there is then it becomes a partisan thing rather than quite an inclusive broad thing. So I think by necessity it needs to be that broad church, although that has obviously had its issues, especially for the SNP, especially in recent years. So it needs to be a broad church, but we also need to be aware that not everyone is going to get on, and not everyone's going to agree on the path, especially once independence happens. Then you have a new kettle of fish. But yeah.
As we look forward, Fraser, and post-election, what would you like to see post-COVID-19 recovery, and what would you like to see from Scotland in the next 5 years? Would it be another referendum on the table for you? Would it be more greener policies being implemented to try and recover a bit from the wrongs that we've did before in the past? How would you like to see Scotland progress in the next 5 years?
So I would I would break that down into chunks. I would say in the next year, on the back of COVID, Like we said before, climate change is this big formative moment in human history. I think COVID has added to that. We now have this small window where we can effectively start to change some of the systems that have been in place for the better. So I think COVID recovery that focuses largely on green jobs, on retraining, on well-being rather than prioritising growth, that focuses on sort of health over wealth, not to get too fuzzy about it. But a COVID recovery that takes this opportunity for the just transition that we've been talking about, that's a big must for me over the next year. After that, I would say an independence referendum. I found this very, very frustrating where people say there's a pandemic on and you're still fucking talking about independence. It's like, oh, you can care about more than one thing at a time. More than one thing at a time is important. And whether you like it or not, this is on the mind of Scottish voters. It might not be at the front of their minds, but Scottish voters are still expecting independence to be an issue for the next term of Parliament. They're expecting a referendum. And I think from a purely political analysis point of view, if it doesn't happen under Nicola Sturgeon, this is probably her last Parliament. And it's unlikely that it's going to happen anytime soon. You're going to be waiting a very, very long time for another leader who's to build up that reputation of competence and of stewardship and of people supporting her and liking her across the board enough to win enough people round to the idea of independence. So I think I would like to see a referendum because I think it's important. I think we've been talking about it. I think it's in the interest of the Scottish people to have it and get it done with one way or another as well, right? So we can get on with making sort of more transformative policy choices. But first, I would like to see the opportunity that COVID presents, not to put a positive spin because it's been horrific, but to see that opportunity seized to promote a just transition, to reimagine transport now that people are sort of thinking about maybe working from home more or using cars less and all this kind of stuff. Seize that opportunity while we have it, while people are thinking more about health and all that kind of stuff, and create jobs and obviously support businesses, get people through the pandemic first, and then into a referendum somewhere from the mid to latter part of the next parliamentary term.
One final thing from me. When it comes to parliamentary numbers and politics and the election and all that, whether the SNP get a majority or not, would you like to see them ask the Greens to enter a formal coalition and maybe give them land reform, transport, the environment, and cabinet roles sort of thing?
Fuck yeah, absolutely, of course. That's now again. I'm not a member of the Green Party. I'm not an avid. Oh, the Greens are the best. I'm all about the Greens. I like a lot of what the Greens talk about. I think they have a lot of issues and they can be very fuzzy. That they can talk about things in often overly abstract terms. Sometimes, not exclusively. They do better at it these days, but they can do sometimes. But broadly speaking, yeah, I think coalition government is generally better than majority government. Majority government gets more done, but when the whole idea of Holyrood is it's designed to be a more consensual system. It's designed to create coalitions of people that you might not normally put together to have representative policy making as well. So when I say I would like to see the SNP and the Greens in coalition, that for me is spot on. It's ideal. It mixes all the things that I care about and that my sort of beliefs are built on. It mixes them all into one nice sort of majority government or coalition government. But in general, I think coalition is a good thing. I'm not a believer in, you need efficient policy making or you need impactful policy making and you can only do that with one party. I'd rather take an extra few weeks debating a bill and have that bill reflect the needs and the voices of different groups and different people than have just a majority government, such as the Conservatives in the UK just now, fucking ramming stuff through left, right and centre, and everyone else is powerless to do anything about it. So hell yeah, I'm a big advocate for an SNP Green coalition, or even a Labour Green coalition down the line. I would love as well. But generally speaking, I think coalition and I think consensus, such as Holyrood was originally supposed to promote and supposed to stimulate, I think that's generally a good thing, and I'd love to see more of it. Which is why, as well, not to drag this answer out too much, but we all touched on the debate the other week when Labour especially reached out the olive branch, but all the parties, there were a couple of issues where we say, well, we're willing to work across the chamber on this. I think that's a good thing. I think that's a good product of Scottish politics. I think that's Scottish politics at its best. And in general, we absolutely need a whole lot more of that.
Yeah, I think you're spot on there, Fraser, that we need to learn to work together and put the old issues of the past to the back of our minds and move forward to try and build a fairer and more just society. So certainly the next few weeks will be interesting. The election results are going to be very interesting. But for now, me and Patrick would like to thank you for coming on to our very first episode of State of Politics, and wish you all the best for the future.
And where can people find you?
Yeah.
Oh, they can find
Also
me.
that too.
They can find me everywhere. Twitter at Fraser JF Stewart. That's where you're going to catch most of my shit. Same handle Instagram, same handle on Medium for stuff that I'm writing. All that good stuff. Twitter is the first stop for it. That's where you're going to find me doing most of my rambling and my shouting into the fucking void. But I know. Thanks very much for having us. I appreciate it a lot, and I hope people can take something away from it as well.
Thank you for coming on.
Cheers, Fraser.